Welcome back to the Buffalo Reformed Podcast. We are a collective of Reformed Christians who meet monthly to discuss theology, culture, politics, and education. I'm your host, Aaron Masters. I'm a pastor at Covenant Reformed Church in Western New York. This podcast exists to connect and encourage like-minded brothers and sisters in Western New York as we work to see this region won for Christ. We encourage our listeners to seek this goal by being devoted to Christ, to their family, to their community, and to their local church. In this episode, I am joined by Dr. A.K. Shauku. Dr. Shauku holds a JD and a PhD in political science from the University of Alabama. He has also lectured and written for the Theopolis Institute. Dr. Shauku discusses the open nature of our political situation in America. Our American Constitution is not quite as objective as we would like to believe. This can be both a good and a bad thing. On the one hand, we have the privilege of living in an open, consensual system of government where the church is free to persuade its community and where community members can engage politically according to their moral framework. It is necessary for the church to attempt to persuade men to love God and their neighbor, and for Christians to be a light-bringing influence on their community by engaging in wise and informed political action. We further discuss the value of nurturing a rich and vibrant Christian community that can be a haven for those disenchanted with the hollow and often meaningless modern and secular society around us. We hope you enjoy this episode of the Buffalo Reformed Podcast. Welcome back to the Buffalo Reformed Podcast. My name's Aaron. We have a special guest with us today. AK, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, AK, do you mind just giving us a brief bio, your background, your training, how you came to be in Buffalo, like all the interesting stuff, just to set up for the listeners who you are?
I am a PhD political scientist. I am also a lawyer by training. I have degrees in Korean language and culture, cryptology, philosophy, and economics. My role right now is I'm an assistant professor of government, planning, and philosophy at Buffalo State University. I'm also the associate director for ethics and policy at our Nano Center there. I'm also the coordinator of our pre-law program. I teach courses across our curriculum having to do with American government, public policy, administrative law, anything in our legal studies curriculum.
So how long have you been teaching at Buff State?
Well, it's been almost, it's been 6.5 years now. So I moved to Western New York from Alabama. I lived for the prior 14 years in Alabama. I spent a portion of that time teaching at the University of Alabama. But then I moved 6.5 years ago to Buffalo for the job at Buffalo State, and I've been there ever since.
And what was your academic career like before you actually got to what your PhD studies were in? What was your undergraduate in, and how did you develop into the actual focus of study that you are interested in now?
Yeah, so my academic journey has been strange and eclectic, but basically I started my career in U.S. Army intelligence. The Defense Department paid for my initial education. Honestly, the Defense Department paid for basically all of my education, one way or another. At first, because I went to Defense Department schools. I'm a graduate of the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center in Monterey, California, where I studied Korean language and culture. I then went to Texas, where we have a satellite campus of the Army Military Intelligence School, where I studied cryptology. After that, I served in the intelligence space, spending some tactical assignments, some strategic assignments. I spent most of my active duty time in Korea collecting intelligence on North Korea in service to the NSA. We have a major intelligence hub in East Asia called Field Station Korea. I worked there collecting intelligence on, I was what's called intelligence interceptor, which basically means foreign radio communications in the target language. For me, that was North Korean. We would intercept those communications. We had to have the ability to translate those communications. There's a lot of sort of science behind getting access to information that folks, our adversaries and competitors, don't necessarily want us to have, and then also countermeasures to prevent them access to the same on our end. So that was my first career. And yeah, all of that was Defense Department schools paid for at the government's expense. And for me, a kid who grew up beneath the poverty line, but who was sort of known to be a good student, it was an opportunity for me to really sort of transition into a professional career where I'm entering it with nothing but maybe a little bit of talent and some grit to get through all of the training. And so that's how I went from being a kid from beneath the poverty line to traveling the world for the United States government, collecting intelligence. So that was my first career. Now, when I left the active service, I transitioned to reserve duty. And I actually I joined a reserve unit in Birmingham, Alabama. And there I was I was an intelligence person in a reserve unit in Birmingham, and I was teaching high school. I actually taught history and English at a private Christian school where I had graduated. And that's a long story, but basically I got a scholarship my last couple of years of high school at this private Christian school. I went and joined the Army and did all of this other stuff. And then when I left active duty and transitioned to reserve duty, I did my reserve duty in Birmingham, Alabama. And I became the first student of this private school to return as a faculty member. And so I did that for a number of years. And then as my family began to grow, this was during the housing bubble, and I took a job in management at a lumber company. Working in that particular industry, there were plenty of people who were close to me, actually an elder in my church, who said, oh, he was a law professor. He still is a law professor. He told me I was not, these are my words, not his, but basically I was not self-actualizing because I wasn't using some of my talents in the industry in which I was working. And so he is actually, his name was David, Elder David, convinced me to go back to school. And I ended up going to the University of Alabama, and David convinced me to apply to the law school. But I also saw that the University of Alabama they had just started a joint JD PhD program where you could pursue a PhD in either political science or economics and a law degree concurrently. And I would basically, split my time between two very different parts of campus, very different types of nerds in the graduate school versus the law school. And they each thought I was crazy for doing the other thing. In the law school, they were like, wait a minute, you're working on a PhD? That's crazy. But over in the grad school, they would be like, you're working on a law degree? That's crazy. So wherever I went, people thought I was crazy. And at the beginning of each semester, I remember being so excited about what I was going to learn. But by the end of the semester, I always thought, maybe I am crazy. but then a new semester would start up, and I would look over all of my new syllabi, what I was going to learn, and I was excited again.
Yes.
And eventually I ran out of semesters. But that was, so I ended up doing all the coursework for my law degree and my PhD concurrently. Oh, by the way, I ended up doing the PhD in political science, but doing a lot of coursework in economics. And so that's sort of been, law, political science, economics is sort of my jam. But fast forward, I finished all the coursework from for law school, and I finished all the coursework for my PhD. And, but for the PhD, I still had a dissertation to do. Mm-hmm. And so I was done with law school. So I spent some time while I was still working on my dissertation working as a family court mediator, and having some really, it was a really formative experience. It was really educational. I had some real success in that setting. It is an emotionally heavy sort of thing to do all the time, to sort of sit across from people and help them work through what are often just tragic relational breakdowns. So I did that until I got my first teaching job. And then I actually got my first full-time faculty position still before I had finished my dissertation, which then very predictably delayed me for a while finishing. But then I just got sort of tired of being in that holding pattern, really buckled down and prioritized to finish my dissertation. And then I was working in a full-time temporary faculty position in Alabama when I met a SUNY recruiter at a conference in Atlanta. We got to talking about Buffalo State. We emailed back and forth for, I think, several months, and they eventually offered me a position, and I ended up moving to Buffalo and teaching at Buffalo State. So yeah, that's sort of been the journey, and I've found a great home. I've been to Buffalo several times, over the years. I have some family in Buffalo, but I had never seen much of the city. I'd never really inhabited the city, the different spaces. And so I didn't have a super favorable impression of it when I moved up. I was moving up very much for the job, but I now have a much more thorough sense of Buffalo as a place, and a much deeper appreciation for it. And every time it snows heavily, I remind myself that we don't usually get tornadoes.
That's right. That's right.
Although I told myself we also don't get earthquakes, but a few years ago there was
We did.
an
Yes.
earthquake, and I said,
That's right.
I told my neighbors, I said, look, I was promised heavy snow, but basically nothing else. And yeah, I feel like this was misrepresented.
Yes, that's right. The main theme for the discussion that we'd like your take on is, as a Christian community, as people who have an interest in the welfare of other people in our city, how should we think about engaging in the political sphere and in politics as an institution or a collective group of people that should be operating for the welfare of its citizens? How should we as Christians think about engaging politically or even using politics as a means of pursuing the welfare of the community? And is that even a proper way to look at it?
I think the way Christians should be thinking about their place in the culture can be, I tend to think of it in a couple different buckets. One, I think the posture or spirit in which we engage the broader culture is important. I think our sort of general, the way we sort of frame the society as a whole and where we fit within it, I think is very important. And then I think on the sort of, so posture, orientation, frame, these have to do, again, from an institutional point of view, with our sort of shared understandings. What shared understanding do we bring to the undertaking? I think that's important. That's one category. I think also what should we be doing is a separate category. So when we're engaging the culture, I think it's important to do so in the right spirit. And then when we're sort of doing our own thing internal to our own community, I think it's important to be adequately ambitious about what it is that we're trying to build, something rich and deep and meaningful, something that when what's available in the broader world is understood as weak and unsatisfying, that there's something really rich and deep and meaningful that's on offer, which requires us to be doing the work now internal to our own community, to make it a sort of destination for refugees from the sort of broader, less meaningful, less rich, less deep culture, right? So if the broader culture has a lot of problems, if it is lacking in substance, then the sort of house of faith needs to have its affairs in order and be building something rich and deep and attractive. Something that becomes a destination when everything else on offer is seen as wanting.
When we typically engage in politics, we're looking to put somebody into power who's able to then use the judicial system as a bludgeon for us to get what we want socially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that the battle over judges becomes so vitally important precisely because they are able to wield this sort of, quite awesome power within our system. In other words, they get to look into this often fairly vague document and determine what it means. And when they do so with a black robe on, we assume that they are applying technical expertise to derive an objectively knowable answer. And so often, for example, when conservatives talk about, oh, we need to get our judges on the court so that they can interpret the Constitution rightly, so that they can follow the Constitution. And I go, follow the Constitution? There's not enough there to follow. And so there is this sort of kind of, again, I put it in the same category with there is no Santa Claus. The fact is, there are some provisions that are directly applicable, straightforward in their interpretation. But much of what judges are doing is not interpretation, if what you mean by interpretation is sort of like translation work, right? If, one of the points I make in the article is I say, 안녕하십니까? In Korean, very literally translates to like, are you in peace? But it's really the standard Korean greeting. Probably a better way to render it in English is, hi, how are you? 안녕하십니까? Right? So that's translation. I just took a standard greeting in one language and rendered it in another language. And I could do so in a wooden literal way, peacefully are you doing? Something like that. Or peacefully doing. The subject is omitted in Korean. 안녕하십니까? Or I could render it in a more, in a more natural way by finding an equivalent phrase in English. Okay, this is really the equivalent of the English, how are you, right? In both cases, it's not really a request for information, right? It's just a standard greeting.
Right.
And so that's translation, right? And if I were to bring, one at a time, right, 3 different Koreans down to the studio, right, and said, 안녕하십니까? Please translate, right? They might give slightly different translations, but they'll be pretty close. None of them will be diametrically opposed to the others. But in constitutional law, you can end up with diametrically opposed interpretations. So what that means then, given the possibility of diametrically opposed interpretations, given the problems of the high degree of generality in which rights and powers are specified, and given the fact that both the list of rights and powers is held to be an open-ended list in both cases, that gives a lot of power to whoever it is gets to peer into the document and tell us what it means, right? So, in the 1890s, the court looked at the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and they said there was nothing about separating the races by, providing separate accommodations to people on the basis of race, that was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, right? But by the 1950s, right, what is that, 6 decades later, the court changed its mind. Now, did the court change its mind? In some ways, yes. The historical experience of segregation sort of demonstrated over time that the separation of people according to race was everywhere and always implemented to stamp one of the groups as inferior, right? That was the point of the separation. So in some ways, the court changed its mind because of historical experience. Segregation laws were almost universally there, not simply because people didn't want to hang out together, right? They both wanted to ride the train. They just didn't want to hang out together, right? That was sort of the original reasoning in the Plessy opinion. But over time, it became pretty clear that there was an attempt to relegate a group on the basis of their race to an inferior status. And one of the ways that that status was sort of reified was through the way you sort of gave symbolic meaning to that separate inferior status was by putting them over there. They don't get to inhabit our space. So the factual, like our historical experience may have led to a change of mind of the court, but we can't overlook the fact that the membership of the court was simply different, right?
Right.
Different group of people gave you a different answer and a diametrically opposed answer.
Yes.
Right. So the generality of the language, the open-ended nature of both rights and powers, and the susceptibility of different people and different courts at different times to give diametrically opposed answers.
Yes.
Means that the idea that the Constitution is this definitive technical legal document that can be directly applied. It can sort of be worked out with anybody with adequate expertise, the way a mathematician might do a complex math problem. And maybe there's only a handful of people who are sufficiently skilled to ascertain the answer to engage in the appropriate order of operation to achieve the solution, but the solution is one objectively knowable. So anyone with the training can derive this answer. And that's how we tend to think of the members of the Supreme Court. And I suspect anyone who's followed closely the conversation up until this point, is sort of now calling that notion into question. The Constitution is not a math problem to be worked out.
Right.
It's actually sort of it articulates a basic structure and some of the operations of government, but much of that has been filled in over time by tradition.
Right.
Right. And then it articulates rights and powers that largely leave it to us to sort of fight about later and to work out for ourselves. And the mechanism by which we have chosen to determine these things is by reliance on a group of unelected, lifetime serving public officials that we refer to as judges or justices. And, fair enough, but let's be clear about what we're doing.
Yes.
Right? Like,
yes.
If that's what we're doing, then let's be clear that the reason we care so much about which judges go on the court is not because we want the judges to give us, to follow the Constitution. Rather, we impute to those vague words our own normative framework, our own sort of moral understandings about how we should most appropriately live with one another.
Yes.
We have our own theory.
Yes.
And we would rather people at that node of decision who agree with us.
Yes.
That's what's happening.
But I see this as a Christian person hearing you talk about that, and as somebody who cares not only about the culture being pushed towards righteousness, but also to get back to the original point, which is that we ought to care about the other people, and we ought to then empower other people to care about other people. I see this as an opportunity because if it's true that we're going to be reading into the Constitution our own normative set of moral values, then is it not then true that if the Christian community is successful at engaging political opinion at the grassroots level and building up a consensus of Christian moral value, that would then eventually down the line be reflected in the decisions of the judges who are appointed by elected officials.
Sure. So I think it's important to recognize that what we're talking about is what is it that we value, and what broader moral / political framework we're operating under. But I think you hit it on the head. This goes back to my point about what's the posture in which we are sort of confronting the culture. Is it one where we think what we're trying to get is judges that will kind of like mom and dad settling a question over who gets a toy, right? We're going to these judges that are going to follow the Constitution because the other judges aren't. Okay. Or is it, the fact is, the document itself at a fairly high level of generality articulates some aspirational values that are not sufficiently specified to be directly applied, and require somebody to make a compelling argument and maybe embody a compelling argument about how we should live together.
Yes.
Right. So all of a sudden the goal becomes persuasive.
Right.
Right. All of a sudden we have to confront squarely. Right. What is it? Paul says you've been drinking milk up until this point. Now it's time to eat meat. Here's the meat. Believers in the United States of America live in an open, consensual system in which their main mandate is to be a redemptive influence on their society by being persuasive. Persuasive in what they say, sure. Persuasive in how they say it, sure. But also persuasive in living as an embodied alternative, right? In other words, the fact is we should be building something so compelling that it makes you learn in fitness that if you build up a certain amount of muscle mass, you're burning fat even in your sleep, right? All of a sudden it's doing some of the work for you.
Yes.
Likewise, if the church spent more time just being a compelling alternative culture, that would make much of the argument itself, right?
Yes.
And what we want to avoid is just sort of in a very superficial way being a people defined entirely by what we're against.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so on the one hand, we do need to be engaging with public affairs and be able to identify things that are morally right and wrong. And that's true. And we can be the prophetic voice in the culture. But on the other hand, we need to be building something of substance that's going to actually, in a real way, influence the society.
And let me be clear, because this is often a misconception. I am not suggesting that we should not be concerned with the content of the laws, right?
Yes.
The content of the laws have implications for the patterns of life that we can sort of operate in. But the content of the law also has hortatory effects, meaning people often look to the law for a sense of what is appropriate.
Yeah.
So when things are outlawed, when things are prohibited by the law, over time, we develop a sense that that's a bad thing, right? I would argue that a lot of the ways that, when I look at the history of marijuana policy, I'm just giving a random example. There are very specific political reasons why it was scheduled as a Schedule I drug. It probably should not have ever been Schedule I. It was tentatively so scheduled, and then only later was it up for a declassification, but for political reasons it remained classified as Schedule I, and that's a whole thing in itself.
Right.
But think about what that leads to, right? All of a sudden, you've got federal officials in some cases breaking down doors, terrifying children, shooting the dog. And what were they there for? well, this is a Schedule I substance that's being, right,
Yes.
and it's like, okay, what's the comparative harm here?
Right.
So, that's a rabbit trail. But my point is simply this. By the way, I'm not saying go out and smoke marijuana. Please don't. And if you do, I didn't tell you to do it. My point is one of comparative harm, not necessarily saying I
Yes.
advocate for this thing.
Because it's law, then people are going to look
Right.
at this as a wrong thing.
Yeah. And not even question whether we should break down the door of your domicile,
Right.
traumatize your children, shoot your dog, and then haul you away for any number of years. And,
Yeah.
right. We're no longer even counting that harm, because in our minds, this is a Schedule I substance,
Right.
right? And something must be done.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, all of a sudden when things are prohibited, it does develop over time, a sense of, oh, that's bad. Right. And then when things are permitted, we do kind of assume that which is permitted by the law is, at least okay.
Right.
Right. And so because law has a hortatory effect, part of our redemptive influence is participating as citizens in this sort of deliberative effort to fashion laws that are health inducing for our society, right?
Yes,
We have a duty to participate. Right? If God had placed us in exile in Babylon, right, we would have a duty to be the people of God in Babylon. And if we were drafted like Daniel into the imperial service, right, then that would be
Yes.
the way we could, bring the influence,
Yes.
of the kingdom into that setting.
Yeah.
But that's not the setting in which we operate. We operate in a setting which is open
Right.
to our persuasive influence. But so often, we're just mad that we don't have all the power. And so the posture that we engage with is often a resentful one,
Right.
right? We spend all our time trying to own our ideological opponents, as opposed to persuade our neighbor that this is good for you.
Yeah. And as a good presuppositional person, so like I assume that the Christian truth is good.
Mm-hmm.
And if a law is passed that is in line with God's law,
Mm-hmm.
then it would stand to reason that that would be for the benefit of society.
Mm-hmm.
But if I cannot articulate that
Right.
to someone as to why that would be good for them to do,
Mm-hmm.
then why would they want to implement that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we operate in a system where we affirm the dignity and co-equality, and here's the important one, agency
Yeah.
of humans by requiring that they develop consensus and then act on the basis of consensus. That's a step up from Babylon,
Yes, that's right.
right?
That's right.
And yet I so often hear a sort of sulky, even petulant spirit from believers in our culture, because they're sort of mad at pagans for being pagans.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Instead of recognizing that, right, like, I love the phrase, there but for the grace of God go I,
Amen.
right? If you recognize that somewhere you had your sort of road to Damascus experience,
Yep.
where God arrested you, got your attention, renewed your mind,
Yes.
right? And now you see things so much differently,
Yes.
and it shapes how you live. Well, your neighbor hasn't had that, right?
Right.
Right? Maybe hasn't had that yet. And because they too have agency, they need reasons to do it the way you want to do it.
Exactly.
We want to make them.
Yes. And maybe this could get to the next question, which is, what role then for the Christian does the liturgy, from your perspective, play in our political engagement? And what I mean by that is, if a person hasn't had that Damascus Road experience, then I would argue that our primary role as Christian people is to try and lead them to that Damascus Road experience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that we're going to be taking the place of the Holy Spirit, because obviously,
Mm-hmm.
as good Calvinists, we would believe that the Holy Spirit moves when and where and how he pleases. However, he uses means,
Mm-hmm.
and we as the means, given the ministry of reconciliation with the people that are at enmity with God,
Mm-hmm.
is it not then our primary responsibility to our neighbor to lead them to that position where they are at peace with God, where they have that Damascus Road experience? They're confronted with the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
They're worshiping God rightly on a weekly basis in the liturgy with that Christian community.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's what's going to turn into a transformed society.
Anyone who's trained in sports, for me, it was my experience in the military. One of the things you learn is that the patterns that you are subjected to shape you.
Yeah.
The patterns that you're subjected to shape you. The rites, rites, and symbols that you are given to, they shape you. And it's not as though you don't have ritualistic experience. But like C.S. Lewis said about philosophy, it's not like those who don't study philosophy don't have a philosophy. Those who don't study philosophy just end up with a bad philosophy. They haven't been trained to think well, so they'll just think poorly. They're not going to not think.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And likewise, those who are not, if we only eat food that is immediately appealing to us and not thinking very seriously about what's good for us, and then attempting to sort of cultivate our taste and align with what is health inducing, right? So you might not like everything that's good for you, but find some things that are good for you that you can, with some effort perhaps, like, right?
Yes.
In other words, in a fallen world, we don't always find that what is most good for us is most pleasant to us. Effort, some intentionality. And so anybody who's ever operated in competitive sport, organized sport, knows this.
Mm-hmm.
I know this certainly from my time in the military. And of course, church should definitely be one of these spaces where we're intentional about our habits of mind and patterns of life, and the symbols that we're populating our environments with, and the ways in which they, over time, in ways that are often imperceptible, like the hobbits and Lord of the Rings, eating the way bread, and over time realizing, oh my goodness, I'm like, my diet has sort of improved me in ways that I would not have perceived. It sort of happened to me slowly over time, right? Likewise, there are ways that being very intentional about the symbols that we surround ourselves with, the habits of mind that we're cultivating, and the patterns of life in our households, and when we gather together as believers, those things shape us in important ways. They make us, sort of who we are. There's a great article by Peter Lightheart about the sacraments as ritual. The fact is, the rituals that we engage in should shape us effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And also, they should tell a story. When we stop talking, the patterns that we operate in should also be telling the story, right?
Yes.
Like the idea of preach the gospel, sometimes use words, right? Our liturgy, right? Our the practices of our households, of our week to week life, of the ways that we move in the specific context of a church setting, in all the ways in which we organize our lives together, should embody a message. And so again, and it's the causation is going in two directions, right? It should shape us, but it should also communicate something to the broader community. And I think it's one of these things where when people are having a health crisis and they decide they need a radical reimagining of their diet and exercise and things like that, they really look for something that, like, where are the healthy people?
Yes.
And what are they doing? For me, I grew up beneath the poverty line in a highly dysfunctional community. And so in my early adulthood, I spent a lot of time watching well-established families and their just rhythms. Often they didn't pull me aside and said, this is what we do and this is why we do it. I just gravitated towards people who seemed to exude a sort of healthy life. And over time, the ways that they did things influenced me, it sort of populated my imagination. It gave me new categories to think about how to do things. And just that alone helped me to be a better father than I otherwise would have been.
Yeah.
Right. It still informs how I understand how to relate to my wife, all these sorts of things, how I think about hospitality, all the little things I do when my children are little, because I have a vision of who and what I want them to be like as adults.
Right.
The community I grew up in, none of that, you're trying to keep a kid alive. That's what you're, right? And don't let them embarrass you too much.
Yes.
Right. And so, right. And so I became sort of indoctrinated, right? Quite intentionally, right? I wanted to spend time with people whose habits of mind and patterns of life were radically different, but clearly healthful.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so likewise, I think when people in the world become truly dissatisfied with what's on offer in the settings in which they dwell,
Yep.
they will look around them for what appears to be rich and deep and meaningful and healthy. And that ought to clearly be us. Now, if we're only operating at a fairly superficial level, if we're the same sorts of people who we don't have a rich imaginative life, we're not developing emotional intelligence, we don't have rituals and patterns that really give our lives richness and meaning. If we're the same sorts of folks who are, we're working for the weekend, we're can't wait to sit down in front of the television, our highest aspiration is to get a boat out on the lake and drink a beer.
Right.
Those are all good things, I want to point out. But if that's the sum total of your internal life,
Right.
then you actually, right, no, that's not compelling.
Yes.
Right. The idea that people are going to leave people with agency.
Right.
Right. They are self-directed people.
Yep.
They're going to look around and they're going to see your impoverished, sort of unimaginative life and go, oh, I want to be like that. And then you say, well, you don't understand. We're going to heaven when we die. Right. Like, right. Like that's the sum total of many of our witness. Right. Like we think, look, get with us because we're going to heaven.
Yes.
And it's like, right. So I think we need to think way more about how we, so first off, we can't resent people for not already having this worldview.
Right.
And we can't seek to simply take the levers of power so that we can dominate them.
Right.
Right. In an open, consent-based society that, which by the way, is itself an outworking of Christianity's influence in world history.
Yes.
We finally have these sort of institutions that affirm the dignity and agency of individual humans.
Yes.
And so often we resent it because it means that unbelievers get to do what unbelievers do.
Yes.
And it's like, well, that also means you get to do what, right? The church gets to do what the church is going to do.
But I don't get to sit back on my laurels and let the government do all that for me.
Yeah. We would rather, we deeply resent sometimes not living in a more Christian society. And we talk like we resent it.
Yes.
And we deeply resent any time when we're out of power. And we are sometimes too naively fall for anyone who promises us a path back to influence.
Right.
Right. If, to the extent that we feel like the uncool kids at the high school, when someone comes along and says, I'm going to make you cool again, we have to be honest with ourselves. Some of the psychological pull of some political messaging is not so much, I'm going to bring about a better moral order of your society.
Right.
Some of it is, I'm going to make the dorks the cool kids, right? You don't feel cool, right? Like what is, I hate to pick on this, but I have some issues with Make America Great Again, as if there was some golden era that we desperately want to return to. All of American history is a mixed bag.
Yes.
And the idea that the goal is to go back,
Yes.
given the hope that we have in Christ, that doesn't even strike me as
No.
particularly Christian.
Yeah, and
Right.
even the last 300 years of history
Mhm.
is just a very small outworking of all of Western civilization.
Right. Mhm.
And so to suggest that the American outworking of that is the ideal, I think
Mhm.
is a little bit short-sighted.
Yeah. Yeah. What I think that kind of it sort of betrays the underlying impulse. The fact is, we feel as though we have lost influence. We feel as though we have lost cultural prestige, right? The major cultural institutions are not very much in love with the church, right? They kind of think they know what the church is about. Too often we play into the stereotype, by the way.
Yes.
But they think they know what the church is about, and they've rejected that. And they also see the church as so historically dominant that it needs to be sort of humbled
Yeah.
and sort of
Decolonized.
decolonized. Exactly. Sort of it needs to be sort of humbled and are other groups that have been marginalized and need to be centered, or suppressed and need to be elevated.
Mhm.
And so there is a sort of sense of, we know what Christianity is in the culture, or we know what Christianity is, and Christianity has been so historically, culturally dominant
Mhm.
that it's time for it to take a step back and let some of these other people and
Right.
groups be centered.
Yes.
So that's the posture of much of the culture, which then means many of the most sort of prestigious institutions within our culture
Mhm.
are not, are sort of not in love with the church right now.
Yes.
Fair enough. But then how do we respond to that? Do we go, I long for the days when, the when we had more cultural cachet, and anybody who comes along and promises, the I'm going to sort of return you back to a place of prominence. Well, if that's the goal, what is the goal? Is the goal to be a redeeming influence, or is the goal power, prestige? We don't want to feel like the dorky kids anymore.
Right. Right.
Right. And so often, like all human motivations, I'm not suggesting it's all one thing or the other. We should always interrogate to what extent our motivations are alloyed.
Right.
Right. Our motives are mixed.
Yes.
And because sometimes when there's too much of the unworthy motivation mixed in, it can shape how we engage the culture at large. What's the spirit in which we do so? Are we just trying to own our political opponents, political enemies, right?
Right.
Or are we trying to love our neighbor who, by our lights, is misguided and tending towards their own doom and maybe some negative, broader societal outcomes as well, right? Like if we're doctors diagnosing and attempting to treat a patient, that's a different posture than we are. And by the way, even doctors have to recognize the agency of their patients.
That's right.
Right. That's different than if we are simply people who are resentful that we're not as cool as we used to be,
Mm-hmm.
and Some people said some snarky things about us on the internet, and we need to put them in their place, right? Like I'm sorry, that's a less worthy impulse. And sometimes a politician I won't name, I criticized him to a friend, and he said, well, we know he's not a choir boy. We don't want a choir boy. We want a champion. And I thought, oh, so it's about power.
Right.
You don't actually care
Yes.
how you get there. You just want to be on top.
Right.
A farther sighted perspective would recognize that there are some short-term victories we could win at the expense of the broader witness.
Yes. Yes. And I think Doug Wilson describes that as reformation rather than revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Because a revolutionary is looking for change now,
Mm-hmm.
whereas somebody who's looking for reformation is playing the long game,
Mm-hmm.
and they're okay with those long-term gains rather than the short-term ones at the expense of the long-term ones often. So if you had to boil all this down for me practically as we kind of close this out here, what would you say my focus should be as a Christian? So like I'm somebody I'm politically engaged. I care about what's happening in my local community. I care about what's happening federally. I care about my nation and my community, and I'm interested in there being a righteousness that is established in the land for the betterment of me and my neighbor. But I'm also a devoted Christian who recognizes that the true worship of God is really the ultimate thing here. So what would your recommendation be for somebody like me in terms of how I should be thinking about going about this political engagement idea that we've been discussing?
Well, specifically with political engagement, right? So prior to political engagement, I would say the church should be the church,
Yeah.
right? And focus on building a culture within the culture that is helpful for those who are within it and attractive to those outside of it who become disaffected by what's otherwise on offer, be an embodied alternative, right? So I would say the church should be the church. Stop worrying about how much cultural prestige they have, and don't be so smitten with people who promise to return the church as such to cultural prominence.
Yes.
Right? So I would say that precedes political engagement. However, the fact is the church in the United States is blessed to live in a context where our institutions affirm the dignity and agency of each person.
Amen.
Not perfectly, but it's a system oriented towards governance by consent.
Yes.
Which means we have as good a shot as anybody to be persuasive that the way we see things is actually helpful, right? 1 Corinthians 6, you who will judge the world, right? Can you not judge these petty matters, right? And of course, in that context, the question is, should Christians take other Christians to court, right? But the whole point there is, to what extent should the church be such a mature group of people?
Right.
And maybe not every individual, but at an institutional level,
Yes.
there should be a lot of wisdom, which has a lot to do with who ends up in leadership within the church.
Right.
But the goal of the church institutionally should be to build real wisdom and compassion. Both those things together, not one in isolation. In the sort of rank and file members, right? So the church should be the church. Now, because we are nested in a consensual political order, in a providence of God,
Yes.
and we are surrounded by unbelievers, I would say also in the providence of God,
Yes.
right? That's a mission field.
That's right.
Then we ought to engage in the deliberative effort of shaping policy in ways that are health inducing, as citizens, as co-equal citizens, not as sort of conquistadors who are going to sort of, I think C.S. Lewis said, they who torment you for your own good will do so without end and without mercy.
That's right.
For they do so with the approval of their own conscience.
That's right. Yes.
Right. So, we shouldn't be these people who are like, I'm going to dominate you, but it's good for you. Rather, we should recognize that in the providence of God, we live in a consensual political order where if we're inclined to use it, we can have considerable influence. It requires us to cultivate a general persuasiveness.
Yes.
But you will never actually develop the capacity to be persuasive so long as your objective is actually just power.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Yes. That's
If
so true.
if you're always hoping, right, like a person who's always hoping to hit the lottery is constantly going down to the local gas station and buying lottery tickets. They're blowing all their money on lottery tickets. They're not actually spending a lot of time, developing their career.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like they want a shortcut. And so likewise, folks who are really, when it comes down to it, just hoping that the levers of power are going to make themselves available to them are not developing the capacity to persuade. But a classic example, I don't know how much time we have, but a classic example is I tell my students all the time in my public policy class that Walmart, Amazon.com is just as much of a bureaucracy as your local DMV. They're both bureaucracies. They both are a human response to complexity. They're both an attempt to take a complex task, utilizing a bunch of different people in service to a bunch of different people over a long time horizon, render it in a consistent and fair and efficient way, right? So we do compartmentalization of responsibility, hierarchy, rule-bound administration. So we have standard operating procedures for everything. Every corporate structure like that is like that, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. What's the difference? When you go down to the DMV, they have a monopoly. They're not actually worried. They are the ones who license you to drive.
Right. Yes.
You're going to come to them regardless. And it's not that they don't care about you, but they don't have to worry about losing your business. So nobody in charge is up nights trying to think about how to streamline the user experience because they're afraid you're going to go elsewhere.
Right.
Right. On the other hand, private bureaucracies
Yes.
operating in a competitive landscape, right? Your Walmarts, your Amazon.com, your Target, right? They know that if they don't figure out how to anticipate and serve the needs and preferences of their consumers, they will lose their consumers to their competitor. And so they're constantly developing new ways to anticipate and cater to the needs and Now, obviously, the church in our society, we're not Walmart, we're not Target, we're not simply trying to cater to the preferences of the people around us. There are needs of our neighbors that extend beyond their mere preferences.
Yes.
Right. So, but the point is the same.
Yes.
To the extent that we have or aspire to mere power, we will never develop the capacity to persuade.
Yes. If we're in touch with the needs of our neighbors, then we will have to naturally think about how to communicate truth to them in a way that actually shows them the relevancy of the answer the church has to offer to their need. So in that sense, we are, but that's not us looking.
So are we Walmart or the DMV? Right.
So we're Walmart. We have to be, because if we're not actually demonstrating the relevancy, then we're not being persuasive. And then we're going to lose the consensus, or we have already done that.
Yeah. And I think there's another way to fall off. You asked about liturgy earlier. I am of a high church liturgical orientation, right? I think I'm very, sort of ecumenical. I affirm, sort of a broad range of Christian practice and understanding. But I truly believe that a careful intentionality about the very specific ritualistic way that we approach God in community is very important. And yeah, it's just something we need to spend a lot of time thinking about how to do well.
Yes.
Right. So that's where I'm coming from. Now, I think there's a way to sort of, to extend the analogy, to be Walmart that says, let's make everything the lowest common denominator. Let's turn churches into, concert halls. Nothing wrong with concerts. Let's turn churches into Starbucks. Nothing wrong with Starbucks.
Mm-hmm.
But if the idea is to simply, in the most superficial way possible, make the church accessible and relevant, I think there are ways to get that wrong.
Yes.
I do think when people are looking for the good, they often are looking for something pretty radically different from their current experience, right? You see a lot of folks in Hollywood that become Buddhists, right? Why? Right? Because they're trying to, in their imagination, right? They're trying to conceive of a radically different and potentially more satisfying way of living. And so they think of something truly exotic from their experience. And unfortunately, too many Americans think they know what Christianity is.
Right.
And again, too often Christians play into
the stereotype.
Exactly. Right. But my point is, there are ways we should be thinking about how to meet our neighbors where they are, but there are also ways in which we should be unapologetically different. And it requires judgment and the cultivation of judgment to figure out which is which.
Yeah.
Right. And so, so we should participate as citizens in the making of the laws, and we should engage with our neighbors directly in ways that are persuasive. And beyond that, we should be the church. And it matters entirely the sort of spirit in which we do that. Ones in which we are thankful to God that we live in an open, consensual political order where we are free to be who we are, and we are free to persuade others to join us if they will.
Amen.
And we have the opportunity to persuade as many of them as possible, even who don't believe what we believe, that some of the ways that we want to live collectively are simply good, whether they believe, in our God or not.
Yes.
And I think that's vitally important.
Yes.
And so, those are the things I would say.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to explain all this to us. We do really appreciate it. So if, barring giving New York State more of my tuition money, how can people follow your work if I'm not going to take classes at Buff State? Where are you writing or doing work people can follow?
Well, I publish in places that no person would probably read unless they're having trouble sleeping. But I am developing more of a habit these days of being active on my blog. That's at my website, akshauku.com, akshauku.com. And the article you just referenced on indeterminacy of constitutional rights and powers is one of the more recent things that I've posted there. There'll be other things in that sort of series. I'm constantly teaching about things and encountering questions and conceptions and misconceptions in students, and sometimes that inspires me to sort of write for a more general audience. And I'm trying very hard these days to make sure that I'm communicating in ways that are sort of generally accessible. And so, so some of what I'm doing can be found in that particular setting. Yeah, I invite folks to check it out.
Yeah, I'll have it linked in the show notes today. So
sounds great.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.